Time slips through trembling hands, and the final hour draws near. Each prophecy foretells a different path to ruin, yet all converge on the same chilling truth. The end is closer than we dare believe. Dare you peer into these visions of doom and face what lies ahead? Professor Edwin Glazier had devoted his life to deciphering obscure manuscripts. He took pride in his meticulous research, which focused on cryptic texts that most historians dismissed. Late one evening, he stumbled upon a curious bundle of parchment referred to as the Clockwork Testament. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a tangle of arcane symbols and half-faded diagrams. Yet the deeper Edwin delved, the more he sensed he was peering into the future. Or perhaps the future was peering back at him. The text described a grand cosmic mechanism that governed the turning of ages. Minute cogs and gears, it claimed, were etched into the very fabric of the universe. Should any part slip out of alignment, a chain reaction would ignite the unstoppable demise of all creation. These passages hinted that humankind was but a single cog among countless others, powerless to alter the system. The only hope, it suggested, was to understand its ticking countdown. Edwin found himself working late into the night, reading the same pages over and over, convinced the text held a final clue, an exact date and time for the universal collapse. Lines of numbers recurred, always preceded by esoteric references to planetary alignments. He thought perhaps it was an ancient astrological record. But the more he studied, the more he suspected the numbers corresponded to modern measurements. Planetary orbits matched known data, and certain references to solar flares mirrored real scientific findings. He grew increasingly certain that the text predicted an event only a few months away. His colleagues scoffed when he tentatively shared his theory, calling him a victim of confirmation bias. They cited previous doomsday claims that came and went without impact. Determined to validate his findings, Edwin sought out mathematicians and astronomers who might confirm the planetary predictions. Most refused to meet with him, politely offering that they were too busy or unimpressed by centuries-old charts. Others listened, eyes widening at his fervor, then quietly suggested he take a sabbatical. Over time, Edwin became withdrawn, haunted by the symmetrical patterns he saw everywhere. Church bells, tolls, train schedules, the pacing of footsteps on a quiet street, all reminded him of the ticking cosmic machinery. He stopped sleeping well, plagued by the same nightmare, a massive clock suspended in an endless void. Each night, the clock's hands inched closer to midnight, but he always woke just before they converged. In a final effort, he privately funded a small observation study. Gathering obscure experts and hobbyist astronomers, he presented the Clockwork Testament. They scrutinized the numbers, cross-referenced star charts, and identified patterns in solar activity that disturbingly matched what the parchment described. Some participants were unsettled to find the text's predictions so meticulously mirrored in real data. Though they lacked definitive proof, a few members of this underground study group began to share Edwin's mounting dread. Word spread among certain fringe communities, fueling speculation on internet forums. Rumors claimed that a hidden cosmic gear was already breaking down. Conspiracies flared, alleging that world governments knew about an imminent cataclysm and were either powerless or unwilling to warn the population. As the rumored date drew nearer, subtle shifts in public mood became noticeable, at least to those paying attention. More people whispered about unexplained anomalies, birds migrating out of season, erratic weather patterns, or a persistent hum that some claimed they could hear on particularly still nights. Edwin's mental state deteriorated. He seldom left his cramped office, living on stale coffee and meager snacks. Books and printouts of star charts filled every available surface. Pinned to the walls were scribbled timelines and predictions. Every hour, he noted changes in the data, searching desperately for a hopeful discrepancy. Any sign that his interpretation might be off by even a fraction. Yet each new set of numbers only confirmed the original prophecy. The cosmic clock was nearly spent. Days before the purported doomsday, a sudden frenzy erupted among those who believed Edwin's findings. Small groups gathered near observatories hoping to witness the final realignment. Others fled cities, convinced that countryside isolation offered protection from cosmic upheaval. In a final attempt at reality, Edwin wrote a brief paper summarizing the data, sending it to news outlets and scientific institutions. Predictably, the mainstream media dismissed it, though a handful of alternative sources circulated his plea. As the last hours approached, Edwin sat alone at his desk. A battered clock on the wall ticked softly, a reminder of everything he feared. The forecast predicted an unusual solar flare, though official channels deemed it mild. The night sky was cloudless, revealing countless stars in crisp clarity. With trembling hands, Edwin checked his calculations one final time. Every angle, every alignment pointed to the same conclusion. The clock would strike its last moment around midnight. The designated hour came and went with no immediate sign of cosmic collapse. Edwin's breath caught in his throat as he stared out the window. The stars maintained their ordinary positions. The moon glowed peacefully. He felt simultaneously relieved and hollow, as though an enormous tension had drained away. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if he had misread the entire prophecy. But just as the clock's hands converged on midnight, an unexplainable darkness swept across the sky. Stars vanished as if someone had extinguished them. Streetlights flickered. Electrical grids failed in several regions across the globe. Televisions went black, and radio signals distorted. In some cities, pockets of panic broke out. People looked to the heavens, glimpsing shifting shadows where the night sky should have been. Their hearts pounded with an instinctual terror. Yet as quickly as it came, the darkness lifted. Power grids restarted, and the stars returned in an eerie wave of light. News outlets scrambled for explanations, calling it a rare atmospheric event or a phenomenon related to solar interference. The majority breathed a collective sigh of relief, chalking it up to natural causes. But Edwin knew better. The cosmic gear had snagged and resumed its turning, if only for now. Something in the universal mechanism had indeed paused, momentarily revealing the fragility of existence. In the aftermath, many dismissed the event, preferring normalcy over the terrifying possibility that life stood on the brink. But a quiet, growing community believed the cosmic machine had skipped a beat. They whispered that the final unraveling might have begun, unstoppable, yet delayed. Edwin himself retreated from public view, believing a deeper countdown now loomed. The doomsday clock had not struck midnight fully. It had only offered a harbinger of what was to come. No one else but those who had read the Clockwork Testament could fully appreciate the significance of that fleeting darkness. They recognized the weight of each second, passing with silent inevitability. And though the world continued spinning, the clock's final hour ticked on in hidden corners of the cosmos, each gear inching closer to the moment when there would be no pause or restart, only the end. A lonely payphone booth stood near a dilapidated service station along Highway 22, its metal frame rusting under relentless winds. Most travelers ignored it, hurrying along the deserted stretch of road toward more populated areas. But locals knew the booth's legend. Every so often, near midnight, the phone would ring, even if no one stood nearby. Rumor insisted that anyone who answered heard a voice predicting an impending catastrophe. Few people admitted to picking up the receiver, but those who did shared the same whispered confession. The voice on the other end already knew their name. Hector Alvarez first encountered the booth on a late-night drive, his car sputtering dangerously low on fuel. The service station was long abandoned, the pumps broken and covered in graffiti. Despite the place being dark and lifeless, the phone's sturdy presence intrigued him. He noted the graffiti scrawled on the glass walls, cryptic warnings like, "Never answer," and "He knows the future." Suppressing a chill, Hector continued on his way, determined not to add another bizarre anecdote to his long journey. A week later, he found himself on the same road at night, ironically compelled by a mechanical breakdown. His car's engine gave out, forcing him to pull over near that very station. With no cell phone reception, he approached the booth with a mixture of dread and reluctance. He needed help, and a payphone was all he had. But as soon as he picked up the receiver, a strange static hissed. Before he could dial, a voice greeted him, calmly stating his name. Shock jolted through him. He replaced the receiver immediately, heart pounding. Later, safe in a motel with a working phone, Hector couldn't shake the incident. He confided in the motel clerk, who claimed to have heard rumors of this midnight caller. Supposedly, the voice predicted large-scale calamities, earthquakes, mass power outages, or plagues in distant lands. According to local lore, the prophecies were always correct. Skeptical yet intrigued, Hector decided to investigate. He documented stories from truckers, road workers, and a few ex-residents. Each witness recalled a moment they had answered the phone at midnight, only to hear a calm voice reciting a catastrophic event soon to occur. Driven by curiosity, Hector began visiting the booth nightly, waiting for a ring he wasn't even sure would come. One cool evening, as the clock neared midnight, the phone emitted a shrill sound that cut through the silence. Hector lifted the receiver, steeling himself for the mysterious voice. "Are you still there, Hector?" it asked, as though picking up a conversation paused moments earlier. He struggled to speak, his throat dry with unease. The voice then said, "In 7 days, a dam will collapse on the Agreste River. Hundreds of lives will be lost." The line clicked, leaving no chance for follow-up questions. Alarmed, Hector noted the date and rushed to inform local authorities. They dismissed his warning, unwilling to act on the word of a disembodied prophet. Desperate, Hector called news stations and posted online pleas, but few believed him. The week passed in nerve-wracking anticipation, and he felt torn between wanting the prophecy to be wrong and fearing it might be right. On the 7th day, he watched the clock anxiously, praying no catastrophe would unfold. That morning, a mild earthquake shook the region near the Agreste River, causing a minor breach in an aging dam. Engineers scrambled to contain the damage before it could escalate. Fortunately, no collapse occurred and no lives were lost. Relieved, Hector thought the prophecy had failed. Later, he learned that swift repairs and emergency protocols had narrowly averted disaster. Some might argue that the voice had spurred him to action, thereby helping to prevent tragedy. But Hector couldn't be sure. Despite the partial relief, the phone continued to ring on subsequent nights. Each call offered fresh glimpses of potential doom. A looming pandemic in a faraway country, a wildfire set to ravage an isolated forest, or civil unrest sparking in a city across the ocean. Time and again, the events transpired, though often in altered forms that the public or the media struggled to connect to the phone's predictions. Hector grew convinced that the voice's accuracy depended on whether people took its warnings seriously enough to intervene. He began to suspect the calls were part of a broader pattern, as if the voice was seeding these dire events to shape an unknown future. Perhaps the warnings were a test of humanity's collective will to act. Each new prophecy weighed heavily on Hector, who felt an impossible responsibility thrust upon him. He spent his days obsessively verifying news reports and gathering resources to publicize the next doomsday call. As time wore on, Hector noticed a disturbing shift in the messages. The voice no longer gave him precise details. Instead, it teased broader and more catastrophic visions: global economic meltdowns, unstoppable pandemics, or cosmic phenomena capable of erasing life on Earth. One night, the voice asked him a question. "If you know the end is near, how will you spend your final days?" Hector could not answer. A cold dread seeped into his bones as he realized he had become tethered to an entity that not only predicted disasters but seemed intent on orchestrating them. Unable to break free from the phone's grip, Hector sank into despair. Each ring after midnight felt like a death knell, tolling for a future he could neither prevent nor endure. Occasionally, he tried not answering, but the phone's piercing sound haunted him, echoing in his mind. Eventually he gave in, picking up the receiver to learn the next impending tragedy. Each prophecy carved a deeper well of fear within him, leaving him hollow and sleepless. Then, without warning, the calls stopped. Days passed, and the booth remained silent. Hector, torn between relief and paranoia, found he could not sleep at all. The cessation felt ominous, as if the final greatest prophecy was about to unfold. He visited the booth day after day, a vigil for an event that might never happen. Dust gathered on the receiver, and a spider wove a web across the corner of the glass. And still, no ring disturbed the quiet nights. Weeks later, a massive solar storm took Earth by surprise, knocking out satellites and power grids across multiple continents. Panic ensued, but eventually, systems recovered. The doomsday scenario never reached absolute collapse. Hector, cut off from communications during the event, realized that if the phone had rung, he never heard it. Whether the voice had chosen to remain silent or had simply vanished, he could not say. In the aftermath, Hector reflected on the phone's role in his life. He suspected it had not truly vanished, but had moved on, perhaps to another payphone or another lonely road. The final question from the voice echoed in his mind. How will you spend your final days? He understood now that the prophecy of global disaster had always been overshadowed by a more personal reckoning, the terror of living in constant fear. Ultimately, the phone had taught him that while doomsday might loom at every turn, one cannot forever stand at the edge anticipating disaster. Eventually, you must either step forward into living or let the dread consume you. Ashen Hill was once an affluent suburb, boasting tidy lawns and pastel houses arranged in neat rows. Over time, shifting economies led to slow decline. Shops closed, schools merged, and the quiet suburb grew quieter still. Yet despite the disheartened exodus, one figure refused to leave. Matthias Barlow, a self-proclaimed prophet who wandered the emptied streets, preaching the imminent end of days. His was a familiar face to the handful of remaining residents, though few took his words seriously. Clad in a threadbare coat, Matthias would stand on street corners with a handwritten sign reading, "Repent now, the day is at hand." Most bystanders labeled him delusional. Yet a peculiar rumor persisted. In the early years, some of Matthias's more modest predictions had actually come true. Small catastrophes, local tragedies, he seemed to foresee them all. Over time, he claimed to receive visions of escalating doom, culminating in a singular event that would erase Ashen Hill from the map. Marion Caldwell, a community volunteer, was perhaps the only person who tried to understand Matthias. She offered him warm meals and asked him why he believed Ashen Hill was marked for destruction. Matthias spoke of nightmares in which the ground cracked open beneath the suburb, swallowing entire neighborhoods in a fiery abyss. He described seeing an unearthly glow in the sky, followed by a thunderous roar that spelled the end for every living soul in the region. While it sounded absurd, Marion recognized the sincerity in his terror. His dire warnings escalated when an old factory on the outskirts suffered structural damage. Locals assumed the building, abandoned for years, had finally succumbed to neglect. But Matthias insisted it was a sign, the first tremor of a chain reaction. He spent nights pacing the perimeter of the factory, placing strange totems near the fences, little effigies made from scrap metal. When asked why, he claimed these totems could absorb the negative energy of the land and postpone the cataclysm. A few onlookers began to worry. They feared Matthias might cause an accident in his obsession or draw the attention of law enforcement. Yet he never trespassed, never vandalized. He simply placed his totems, sang obscure hymns, and pleaded for anyone to join him in nightly vigils. For a time, it seemed harmless enough. But then the local news reported heightened seismic activity beneath the region. Though no large quake had struck yet, the signs indicated potential fault line disturbances. A creeping worry spread through the remaining residents, giving Matthias's predictions an uneasy plausibility. Marion reluctantly agreed to stand vigil with him one evening, hoping to glean more about his motivations. They met at the cracked pavement outside the factory gates, the sky overcast. Matthias carried a battered notebook brimming with cryptic sketches. Swirling lines, blocky shapes, cryptic references to cosmic alignments. In hushed tones, he claimed these were glimpses he received in his visions. He pointed to a date circled in red ink less than a month away, labeling it the day of unveiling. He insisted that the entire suburb would be wiped out unless the community united in an act of contrition. Marion tried to reason with him. Ashen Hill was practically deserted. Who remained to unite? And what form would this act of contrition take? Matthias had no concrete answers. He rambled about building a sanctuary, offering prayers to appease a wrathful force, or perhaps evacuating if unity proved impossible. He seemed as desperate as he was earnest. Marion left with a heavy heart, uncertain whether to dismiss him or to quietly prepare for the worst. In the following weeks, minor tremors rattled the area, enough to crack windows and unsettle the few stubborn families still living in Ashen Hill. The local government, strapped for resources, offered tepid reassurances that the quakes likely amounted to nothing serious. Matthias's frantic pleas, however, grew louder. He claimed that the quakes were harbingers, and that with each one, the final event drew nearer. He organized small gatherings in the deserted shopping plaza, urging attendees to repent and brace themselves. Attendance was sparse, but a handful of frightened souls began listening, if only to quell their mounting anxiety. As the circled date approached, a hush fell over Ashen Hill. The atmosphere felt charged, like the tense lull before a storm. A sense of collective dread permeated the abandoned streets, even among those who refused to believe in prophecies. Marian watched with concern as Matthias paced the neighborhood nightly, adding more totems to the sidewalks, painting cryptic sigils on boarded-up shop windows. She found him one evening, hunched in prayer, weeping softly as he murmured about how humankind had forsaken the earth. Finally, the appointed day arrived. It began like any other. Gray skies, a light wind brushing over deserted lawns. Matthias stood at the factory gates at sunrise, awaiting whatever doom would descend. Marian joined him, compelled by equal parts compassion and fear. The hours crept by without incident. Some people ventured outdoors, uncertain whether to treat the day as normal or to hide in their homes. By late afternoon, tension reached its peak. A crowd gathered around Matthias and Marian, waiting for a sign, a quake, a roar, something to justify the fear building in their chests. Just before dusk, ominous clouds gathered. A low rumble of thunder rolled over the horizon. Matthias raised his arms, tears streaming, proclaiming this was it, the final hour. Lightning split the sky, illuminating a bleak landscape. The ground vibrated beneath their feet, but the tremor felt no stronger than previous ones. In a final frenzy, Matthias urged everyone to kneel, to cry out for forgiveness. Many scoffed, but several complied, dropping to the cracked pavement with desperate hope. Moments later, the sky opened with a torrent of rain. But no apocalypse followed. The ground held steady, the thunder faded, darkness settled, and the group dispersed, cold and soaking wet. Matthias sank to his knees, trembling with confusion. Marian placed a hand on his shoulder, unsure how to console him. Eventually they parted ways. That night, the storms cleared, leaving behind a silence that felt almost merciful. Over the next few days, life in Ashen Hill returned to its usual lethargy. The quakes seemed to subside, and some residents even joked about the end of days that never came. Matthias grew reclusive, apparently humiliated or existentially drained by the failed prophecy. Marian visited him in the small, cluttered apartment he rented, finding him in a state of morose disbelief. He confessed that perhaps his visions were symbolic, a reflection of personal guilt. Or perhaps the sincerity of the small group that prayed had staved off the final moment. He couldn't be certain. Days later, an industrial development firm announced plans to demolish the crumbling factory and transform the area into a commercial hub. Construction crews arrived, bulldozers in tow. When they excavated deep into the factory's foundation, they discovered a massive sinkhole, dangerously unstable. Immediate evacuation notices were issued, as experts concluded that a catastrophic collapse might occur if the sinkhole expanded. Indeed, late that very night, part of the factory grounds caved in, sending debris plunging into the earth. Though the damage was contained, the potential for a widespread sinkhole lingered. Ashen Hill's final exodus followed swiftly. Most residents left, unwilling to remain on precarious ground. As for Matthias, no one could say what became of him. Some claimed to have seen him standing at the sinkhole's edge, arms lifted as if in prayer. Others insisted he left before the collapse, continuing his nomadic prophecy elsewhere. Regardless, the outcome for Ashen Hill aligned unnervingly with Matthias's warnings. The suburb's end was neither fiery nor immediate. It was a slow, inevitable decay swallowed by time and shifting earth. In the aftermath, Marian reflected on his doomsday fervor. Had the near collapse validated his visions, or had he misread a simpler reality of geological change? She never found a definitive answer. Yet the memory of his tearful pleas remained. She considered the possibility that doomsday prophecies need not arrive in a single cataclysmic instant. Sometimes, the end creeps in through neglected foundations and unheeded warnings, dissolving a place long before its people realize it's gone. The hourglass never stops, and these visions of doom lingered just beyond our everyday concerns. Is your world safer for not believing, or does the clock tick all the same? Thank you for daring to explore these prophecies. Remember, not every doomsday comes with a warning.